Hello, I'm Jan Stransky, Assistant Clinical Professor of Neurology at Yale, and this is my left hand or right hand assistant Karel, which is a Czech name for Charles. He's our office golden retriever, and he's going to be assisting me in our little chat. I'm going to put him down here for a second. He's got a Czech name because I'm speaking to you from Prague, which is where I also live and work. So I have the benefit of having an international perspective on certain issues. And as a neurologist who practices on both sides of the ocean, I'm very fortunate to be able to see how the American system works, as well as how the European system works. And I've got a lot of friends on both sides of the ocean, and since my area of interest is neurophilosophy, which deals with using neurology to answer philosophical questions, I've been asked by a lot of them to make this short, tiny video for you regarding my thoughts on the current COVID situation as it pertains to the human brain. I want to make it absolutely clear that what I'm going to say is purely subjective. I do not formally represent any institution in this regard. Along the way, my other main area of interest is the impact of media on neurological evolution and on thought, on how we learn, on what it does to the brain, and I'm talking about mass media as well as social media. And I'll give it away up front that my conclusion regarding the current situation of the current COVID epidemic and media is intimately linked. So I'm just going to lay out a few basic points regarding the current situation. I think the first one is what it's taught us, or what it brings to light, at least to me, is that not all human life is equal. We may think so as physicians, but in reality, if you look at the numbers, they tell their own story. I'm going to look down a little bit at some of these numbers because I don't have them memorized, but at least to date, in the first week of May, as far as the COVID epidemic is concerned, about 300,000 people in the United States have unfortunately, about 300,000 people worldwide have lost their lives to the current epidemic, around 80,000 of them in the United States. The United States is bearing a big burden of that. We'll talk about that in a second. However, according to the World Health Organization last year, 650,000 people, which is more than twice as many, died from the ordinary flu. And respiratory-linked illnesses, 770,000 died from HIV, 3 million died from hepatitis and TB. A life is not the same as a life, at least as far as the media coverage that it's getting now. We could make a very good case, and I think the case is there to be made, that in light of the large preventative measures against the current epidemic, that death toll would still be higher. But question number one, for which I don't have an answer, but which should be asked, and perhaps we will get an answer once the full data are out, is how much have the preventative measures actually contributed to saving lives, which they undoubtedly have, thank God, and how many lives would they have saved? And if we're going to think about saving lives, then why don't we enact an equal amount of prevention in terms of money, resources, restrictions, and social barriers every September or October when the flu comes around? Why don't we do the same thing as far as HIV and hepatitis and TB are concerned? The neurologic answer to that is all of these other diseases that we talked about are known. And COVID is an unknown factor. And over the many hundreds of thousands of years of evolution of the brain, it always paid to pay more attention to things that we don't know, that we think can hurt us, rather than to things that we know, even if we know that they can hurt us. So we sort of have a predisposition to give the epidemic our full neurologic attention. Neurological trait number 2 is and you can see this a lot in politics. If something is endlessly repeated, even if it's bent out of shape, sooner or later we come to believe in the fact that it may be true. So if the headlines over and over again, and if the media over and over again continues to bombard us with anything, no matter what that thing is, sooner or later it will start to sink in and it will become the dominant element of our lives. My personal conclusion is that COVID is a very real and dangerous epidemic, but the true epidemic that's happened here, one that we should be most aware of, is the epidemic of media and media hysteria, which created this epidemic, blew it out of shape, and caused massive consequences that are social and economical and political, which are going to outweigh the medical consequences, because each epidemic has two aspects from day one. Since we've known about epidemics, it's got a medical aspect to it, where it comes, it goes, and it disappears. COVID will disappear. It may reappear again. We don't know that yet because viruses mutate. And then it's got a social aspect to it, which begins as the epidemic begins to fade. And those social consequences and what happens during those consequences is what's going to be very interesting. And I think we have a unique opportunity to address those social consequences now and start talking about them because they're important. So the media have created a culture of hyperbole, which, speaking as a physician, has also influenced medical care and us physicians, because we've been driven into a particular mindset where the COVID epidemic is treated as sort of an enemy from World War III, and all of our psychological as well as our physical and financial resources have been devoted and hurled at this epidemic at the expense of patient care. I don't think there's a physician I know on either side of the ocean who's not going to say that we've been stressed out more than usual and that our attentions have been very much devoted to this epidemic, quite oftentimes at the expense of not delivering care as we would like to our other patients. I know this is particularly true for nurses, and some of my colleagues have been transferred from one department to another, or particularly to take care of COVID patients, even if they were pediatricians who have no ICU experience. They've been transferred into the ICU, and nurses I know have been laid off from ambulatory clinics that have been put on hold or closed because of the current epidemic. Probably not a good thing. The other thing is, we need to know where it came from. We're going to have the data sooner or later. Not that we want to blame anybody, and I don't put this forward as a political question, but in any case, I think it's quite clear that this virus, in all likelihood, is a product of human activity. This is not something that emerged on its own somewhere, whether it was created in a lab in the US or in China. It's a product of human activity. It's basically something that we created and we messed up. COVID virus is a perfect metaphor for our times in that sense. We overstepped the line. Once again, we put our foot into Mother Nature where it didn't belong. At the same time, many of the restrictions that we've imposed have led to cleaner air, cleaner waters, cities that have been full of smog, like Beijing, Mexico City, Delhi, and other cities, are now completely clear. The skies are clear of polluting aircraft. And I think for many of us, myself included, it's an interesting observation, perhaps even refreshing, that paradoxically, over a very short period of time, we've returned the world to where it should be. So we've got these two sort of issues on the one hand. On the one hand, we sort of messed up. And on the other hand, we can all see what life used to be like before we got everything going along the way of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and so forth. And a lot of people are saying, yes, we know we've been hurt and so on and so forth, but let's stop the train for a second and take a look at the world the way it is now and see if we can't keep it this way just a little bit longer. And I think that's an interesting discussion that should be had. Third point, neurologic point, We've all been forced home, a lot of home office, those of us who still have jobs. Again, back to the consequences of whether those restrictions were worth it. And we've been pushed into a new technological corner. It's important that we get out of that corner. It's important that we get out of the corner of being reliant on that computer. Home office may be a very good thing, but guess what? For the last 200,000 years, we've been here and we've been learning based on biological priorities and on genetic priorities. And those priorities are one and the same: face-to-face human contact. Computers, working in a computer, staying at home creates a flat, closed world. It does not contribute to anxiety in any other way except badly. It contributes to depression. It contributes to all sorts of problems, particularly among children. There are lots of studies that show the more that you spend time on a computer doing anything, the more you enter a flat world, the more you are prone to anxiety, the more you are prone to depression. Standardized test scores go down in schools, so on and so forth. So we need to get back out of that flat world once this epidemic is over and start to communicate and communicate between ourselves in a constructive fashion. Finally, we need to perhaps examine the philosophical question. And this is a very difficult question for me to pose without it sounding the wrong way. But we are now living 3 generations in an atmosphere of unparalleled commercial growth, capitalism, and essentially lack of threat. Our parents lived in an age of World War II, and there were previous wars and there were previous major threats, but we've pretty much done extremely well over the last 30 to 50 years. And over that time, the standard of living has drastically risen and so on and so forth. And over that time, particularly in civilized countries, in developed countries, I should say, in developed countries, a pervasive attitude of entitlement has set in, and a pervasive attitude which puts immortality first and not respect for the normal biorhythms of life as they exist on planet Earth. We can't live forever, and we shouldn't live forever. We should focus more on the quality of life. We should focus less on entitlement. We should focus more, I think, on the word balance. And we're back where we started from as far as this podcast is concerned. The balance is it worthwhile to put the entire Western civilization on its knees for the amount of lives that have been claimed by COVID? Does it equal? What is the cost value of a human life? These are very, very difficult questions to ask, and I don't have the answer, but I think that they should be asked and they should be approached from a philosophical and from a humane point of view. Because at the end of the day, those of us who have been put out of work, and there's a lot, particularly in the United States now, which has record unemployment, have to face enormous, not just financial consequences, but medical consequences as well, that stem from the lack of care that we're going to get because we don't have the money, that stem from the stress that we're undergoing, and so on and so forth. So where is the line? Where is the balance? Who is actually entitled to what? And what is the medical system and what is the social system and the medical social system that should be in place to deal with this? In the United States, we've seen that we're paying a very high price for the fact that we, as the only country on earth in the OECD that has a high level of development, does not take care of its citizens at a national level. We don't have nationalized health care. I'm not saying we should, but we don't. At the same time, the OECD, those top 25 other developed nations do. And if you look at healthcare systems as a whole, and as a result of those healthcare systems, their outcomes, meaning life expectancy, satisfaction, care of chronic medical conditions. Each and every one of those countries does a better job than we do in the United States. Here in the Czech Republic, dollar for dollar, we spend about 40 cents on healthcare compared to the US. And we do a better job. Why? Because we spend less on healthcare and we use the resources better. The Czech Republic spends 7% of its GDP on healthcare, the OECD about 9%, and the United States spends 18% of what it makes on healthcare. $1 out of $2 spent on healthcare in the world is spent inside the borders of the United States. For that kind of money, the United States has very little to show for it. So that needs to be, I think, looked at, because another national emergency will come. And it would be very good if the United States in particular would come up with a plan for dealing with such emergencies at a national level, instead of letting the individual states deal with it chaotically. Although that may be a good way to go as well if the states decide among themselves. It's a question to be answered. So thank you for allowing me to ramble on a little bit like this. I hope that those of you who've hung on and watched me will find some talking points that will move us into the next stage of this period, the social stage, where we begin to talk about the different things that could have been, should have been, might have been, and hopefully won't be in the future. God bless and stay healthy.